The Hartwell mansion stood as a monument to wealth and sorrow. Its grand halls echoed with the silence of grief, a stark contrast to the laughter that once filled them. Daniel Hartwell, a billionaire widower, paced the marble floors of his home, his heart heavy with despair. His 6-year-old twins, Sophia and Liam, had not spoken a word in a year. Not since the accident that took their mother. Doctors had called it selective mutism, a trauma response. Psychologists suggested patience. Nanny's endless streams of them had come and gone, each failing to reach the children. The twins refused to eat, picking at meals before pushing plates away, their small bodies growing thinner with each passing week. Daniel had tried everything: private chefs, child therapists, even hypnotists, but nothing worked. Then came Grace Johnson. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, her presence as warm as the sunlight streaming through the mansion's stained-glass windows. Unlike the previous nannies, Grace didn't come with a stiff resume or a rehearsed speech about child psychology. She carried a worn leather bag, a knowing smile, and an air of quiet confidence. Daniel barely glanced at her when she entered. He had lost hope long ago. "Mr. Hartwell," Grace said, her voice steady. "I'd like to meet the children." He waved a hand toward the playroom, where Sophia and Liam sat motionless, surrounded by untouched toys. Grace didn't rush. She knelt before them, studying their hollow eyes, the way they flinched at sudden movements. She didn't speak to them right away. Instead, she hummed a soft, familiar tune, something that might have been a lullaby. The twins didn't react, but Grace didn't seem to mind. She simply sat with them, letting the silence settle. Hours passed. Daniel watched from the doorway, arms crossed, skepticism etched into his features. He had seen this before: nannies trying to be gentle, trying to coax the children out of their shells. None of them had succeeded. But Grace wasn't like the others. When dinner was served, a gourmet meal prepared by the mansion's private chef, Grace took one look at the elaborately plated dishes and shook her head. "They won't eat this," she said simply. Daniel frowned. "It's the best food money can buy." Grace met his gaze. "Food isn't about money, Mr. Hartwell. It's about love." Without another word, she rolled up her sleeves and walked into the kitchen. Daniel followed, curious despite himself. He watched as Grace rummaged through the pantry, pulling out simple ingredients: flour, butter, sugar, spices. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Making them a meal they'll actually eat," she replied. Her hands moved with practiced ease, kneading dough, stirring pots, filling the air with the scent of something rich and comforting. Daniel couldn't place it at first, then it hit him. Home. It smelled like home. When Grace set the table, she didn't use the fine china. She used plain, sturdy plates, the kind that wouldn't shatter if dropped. The twins watched her, their eyes flickering with something Daniel hadn't seen in months' interest. Grace placed a plate in front of each child. Golden brown cornbread, still warm. A bowl of creamy mac and cheese, the cheese stretching with every spoonful. Crispy fried chicken, seasoned just right. Sophia hesitated. Liam stared at the food, his small fingers twitching. Then slowly, so slowly, Liam reached out. He broke off a piece of cornbread and brought it to his lips. Daniel held his breath. The boy took a bite. Sophia, watching her brother, did the same. And then, they ate. Not just nibbles. Not just polite bites to appease the adults. They ate, devouring the food as if they hadn't tasted anything real in a year. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He turned to Grace, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you do that?" Grace wiped her hands on her apron, her smile soft but knowing. "Children don't need fancy food, Mr. Hartwell," she said. "They need food that feels like a hug." For the first time in a long time, Daniel Hartwell felt something stir in his chest. Hope. The kitchen of the Hartwell mansion had never seen such activity. For months it had been a place of silent efficiency, where Michelin-starred chefs prepared elaborate meals that were barely touched before being cleared away. But on this afternoon, the air was thick with unfamiliar aromas: the earthy sweetness of cornmeal, the rich tang of melting cheese, the sizzle of chicken in hot oil. Grace moved through the space with quiet authority, her hands performing tasks she'd done 1,000 times before. She measured flour not with precise scales, but with practiced scoops of a coffee mug. She seasoned by instinct, pinches of salt and pepper flicked from her fingers with rhythmic certainty. The twins sat at the breakfast bar, their small feet dangling well above the floor, watching this unfamiliar ritual with guarded curiosity. Daniel lingered in the doorway, his tailored suit looking out of place against the homey scene unfolding before him. He'd intended to observe from a distance, to maintain the professional detachment he'd carefully cultivated since his wife's death. But something about the way Grace worked the easy confidence of her movements, the occasional hum that escaped her lips held him rooted to the spot. The first dish to emerge from the oven was the cornbread. The golden crust cracked audibly as Grace set it on the cooling rack, releasing a cloud of steam that carried the scent of browned butter and honey. Liam's nose twitched almost imperceptibly. Sophia's fingers tightened around the edge of the marble countertop. Next came the macaroni and cheese, its surface a perfect mosaic of toasted breadcrumbs and bubbling cheese. Grace lifted the spoon and let the strands stretch nearly a foot before breaking, the creamy sauce clinging to the pasta in thick ribbons. She didn't speak as she worked, allowing the food itself to do the talking. When the fried chicken came out of the oil, its crust the color of autumn leaves, Grace arranged it all on simple white plates, no silver domes, no artistic drizzles, just honest food served with quiet dignity. She placed the meals before the children with no fanfare, no coaxing words, just a simple, "Here you go," spoken in a tone that suggested she already knew the outcome. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock above the stove. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Daniel felt his shoulders tense with familiar disappointment, already preparing himself for another failed attempt. Then Liam's hand moved. It was barely more than a tremor at first, his fingers creeping toward the cornbread like a small animal testing unfamiliar ground. When they closed around the warm square, a crumb tumbled onto the counter. The sound seemed deafening in the quiet room. Sophia watched her brother with wide eyes as he brought the bread to his mouth. His teeth sank into the soft interior, leaving tiny indentations in the golden surface. A flake of crust clung to his lip before his tongue darted out to retrieve it. Grace didn't cheer. She didn't even smile. She simply turned back to the stove and began preparing another plate, as if this moment wasn't extraordinary at all. Sophia's decision came more slowly. Her fingers traced the edge of her plate before selecting a single elbow of macaroni. She examined it closely, turning it this way and that, before placing it cautiously between her lips. The moment the flavors registered, her entire body seemed to relax by degrees, the tension leaching from her small frame with each successive bite. Daniel found himself gripping the doorframe, his knuckles gone white. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen his children eat with such unguarded pleasure. The clinical meals prepared by nutritionists, the carefully balanced purees recommended by therapists, none of it had elicited this response. Grace set a third plate at the empty space between the twins. This one held smaller portions, cut into manageable pieces. Without a word, she pulled out the stool and sat down with them, picking up her fork and beginning to eat with the same quiet enjoyment she seemed to bring to every task. Something remarkable happened then. As the three of them ate together, the twins began to communicate in their own silent language, a nudge of a plate here, a pointing finger there. Sophia broke off a piece of her cornbread and placed it on Liam's plate. He responded by sliding a chicken wing toward her. These small exchanges spoke volumes in the absence of words. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest as he watched. It wasn't just that they were eating, it was how they were eating. The way Sophia's shoulders had lost their perpetual hunch. The way Liam's feet swung slightly under his chair. The way Grace occasionally nodded in approval without making a show of it. By the time the plates were cleared, truly cleared, not just pushed around, the afternoon light had shifted, painting the kitchen in tones of amber and gold. Grace stood and began cleaning up with the same unassuming efficiency she'd shown throughout. The twins didn't leave their seats. They watched her, their eyes tracking her movements with something that looked dangerously like trust. Daniel finally found his voice. "They ate," he said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. Grace didn't pause in her washing up. Children know real food when they taste it, she said simply. But all the specialists said. Specialists don't always understand what the soul needs to heal. Grace interrupted gently, drying her hands on a dish towel. She turned to face him fully for the first time since entering his home. Your children aren't broken, Mr. Hartwell. They just needed to remember what it feels like to be cared for. The truth of her words settled over Daniel like a weight. He looked at his children, really looked at them, and saw for the first time in a year something that resembled peace on their small faces. Grace moved past him then, carrying the empty plates to the sink. As she passed, Daniel caught the faintest scent of vanilla and spice, something warm and comforting that reminded him inexplicably of safety, of home. In that moment, standing in the golden light of his silent kitchen, Daniel Hartwell felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. The story continues as Grace's presence begins to work small miracles throughout the household. The twins, while still not speaking, start to emerge from their shells in other ways, leaving drawings on the refrigerator, following Grace around the house, even smiling on occasion. Daniel finds himself lingering in rooms he'd previously avoided, drawn by the sounds of life returning to his home. Each meal becomes an event, with Grace introducing simple dishes that speak to something deeper than hunger. Pancakes shaped like animals for breakfast. Grilled cheese sandwiches cut into triangles. Warm milk with honey before bed. The twins respond to each offering with growing enthusiasm, their hollow cheeks gradually filling out, their eyes losing that haunted look. Daniel begins joining them at these meals, at first just to observe, then eventually participating. He learns that Grace's cooking isn't about technique or presentation, it's about memory, about connection. The way a certain smell can transport you, the way a familiar taste can comfort. The mansion, once a cold monument to wealth and loss, begins to feel like a home again. The staff notice the change. The housekeeper leaves fresh flowers in the children's rooms. The gardener starts planting bright blooms where before there had only been austere hedges. Even the austere portraits in the hallways seem less judgmental. As the weeks pass, Daniel finds himself seeking Grace out, not just about the children but for her company. He discovers she is a quiet wit, a sharp intelligence that reveals itself in unexpected ways. She doesn't defer to him like the staff, doesn't treat him like a broken thing to be pitied. The Hartwell mansion had undergone a quiet transformation in the weeks since Grace Johnson's arrival. Where once the grand halls echoed with oppressive silence, now the sound of small footsteps and occasional laughter drifted through the corridors. The change was subtle but profound, like the first green shoots breaking through winter soil. Daniel found himself rising earlier each morning, drawn downstairs by the aroma of brewing coffee and the low murmur of Grace's voice as she prepared breakfast. He would pause in the doorway unnoticed, watching the domestic scene unfold. Grace moved through the kitchen with effortless grace, her strong hands measuring ingredients while she kept up a steady stream of gentle conversation with the twins. Sophia and Liam no longer sat like silent statues at the table. They perched on stools at the kitchen island, their small hands busy shelling peas or stirring batter under Grace's guidance. They still didn't speak, but their eyes were alert and engaged, their heads turning to follow Grace's movements with rapt attention. One morning, Daniel entered to find Grace teaching the children how to make pancakes. Liam carefully poured batter onto the griddle, his tongue peeking out in concentration. Sophia waited with a spatula, her body tense with anticipation. When Grace nodded, the little girl flipped the pancake with surprising dexterity, revealing a perfect golden surface underneath. The look of quiet triumph on Sophia's face struck Daniel like a physical blow. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen either of his children take pride in anything. Grace caught his eye over their heads and gave him a small, knowing smile before turning back to the children. As the days passed, Daniel began joining them for meals with increasing frequency. At first he sat stiffly at the head of the table, unsure of his role in this new dynamic. But Grace had a way of drawing people in without seeming to try. She would pass him a bowl with a casual, "Think you can handle seconds, Mr. Hartwell?" or ask his opinion on whether the potatoes needed more salt. Slowly, the formal dining room fell out of use. They ate instead in the breakfast nook, where sunlight streamed through bay windows and Grace's hearty cooking filled the air with comforting aromas. Daniel found himself savoring meals in a way he hadn't in years, rediscovering the simple pleasure of food made with care rather than culinary pretension. The twins' progress, while still slow, became more evident each day. Liam began leaving drawings on the refrigerator, crude but energetic sketches of the food they ate, the garden outside, Grace's smiling face. Sophia developed the habit of slipping her hand into Grace's as they walked through the house, her small fingers clinging with quiet determination. One rainy afternoon, Daniel returned home early from work to find the house unusually quiet. He followed the sound of soft singing to the library, where Grace sat in the window seat with a child tucked under each arm. She was reading from a worn picture book, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the story. The twins were utterly absorbed, their eyes fixed on the pages as Grace brought the characters to life. When she did the voice of the story's dragon, Liam let out a sound that was almost a laugh. Sophia's fingers plucked at Grace's sleeve, urging her to turn the page faster. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, overcome by a wave of emotion so powerful it left him breathless. This was what his children had been missing. Not just care but connection. Not just nourishment but love. That evening after the twins were in bed, Daniel found Grace cleaning up the kitchen. She stood at the sink, her hands moving methodically through the soapy water as she washed the dinner dishes. The fading light from the window caught the silver strands in her dark hair and the strong line of her shoulders beneath her simple cotton dress. "Grace," he said, and something in his voice made her turn, drying her hands on a towel. They looked at each other for a long moment, the air between them suddenly charged with unspoken understanding. Daniel realized with startling clarity that he'd been waiting for this moment, perhaps from the first day Grace had walked into his home. "I don't know how to thank you," he began, but Grace shook her head. "No thanks needed," she said softly. "Those children." Her voice caught slightly. "They've found their way into my heart." Daniel took a step closer. "And you've found your way into theirs. Into all of ours." The admission hung between them, fragile and momentous. Grace's dark eyes searched his face, seeing more than Daniel had ever allowed anyone to see. The years of grief. The loneliness. The tentative hope that had begun to take root since her arrival. In the quiet of the kitchen, with the scent of that evening's apple pie still lingering in the air, Daniel reached for Grace's hand. Her fingers were warm and capable in his, bearing the small scars and calluses of a life spent serving others. Neither of them spoke. None of the words that came to mind about the children, about the future, about the strange alchemy that had brought them together seemed adequate. So they stood in silence, hands clasped, while the old house settled around them like it was finally, after all this time, exhaling. The days that followed were filled with small but significant changes. Daniel began leaving his office earlier, eager to return home. Grace started setting a fourth place at the table without being asked. The twins, sensing the shift in the adults around them, blossomed further, their silent world expanding with each passing day. One evening, Daniel found Grace alone in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. He came to stand beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "I used to think this house was cursed after Emily died," he said quietly. "Like happiness could never live here again." Grace turned to look at him, her face soft in the twilight. "Grief has its season," she said, "but life always comes back around." Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't open it, just held it between them like a question. Grace didn't seem surprised. She looked at the box, then up at Daniel's face, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "The children," she began. "Love you," Daniel finished. "As do I." The confession, once made, couldn't be taken back. Nor did either of them want to. Grace reached out and covered the box with her hand, her touch warm and sure. In that moment, with the last light of day fading around them, Daniel Hartwell felt something he thought he'd lost forever, the quiet, steady certainty of being exactly where he was meant to be. The morning of the twins' 7th birthday dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the sheer curtains of the Hartwell mansion in golden shafts. Grace woke before sunrise, as was her habit, moving quietly through the sleeping house to begin preparations. The kitchen still bore traces of last night's clandestine activities: flour dusting the countertops, mixing bowls stacked in the sink, the lingering sweetness of vanilla in the air. She worked methodically, her strong hands shaping the dough for cinnamon rolls, the twins' favorite. The motions were second nature now after months of cooking in this kitchen, but today each task carried extra significance. 7 years old, a milestone that should have been celebrated with both parents. Grace paused, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron as she glanced at the photograph on the refrigerator. Emily Hartwell's smiling face frozen in time, forever young, forever beautiful. The sound of small feet padding down the hallway pulled Grace from her thoughts. Liam appeared first, his dark hair sleep-tousled, pajama shirt buttoned crookedly. Sophia followed close behind, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit. Their eyes widened at the sight of the kitchen transformed, streamers hanging from the ceiling, balloons bobbing near the table, the giant 7-shaped cookies Grace had stayed up late decorating. "Happy birthday, my loves," Grace murmured, opening her arms. The children rushed forward, burying their faces against her apron. She could feel the rapid beat of their hearts through the thin fabric, the way their small hands clutched at her waist. For children who had once refused to eat or speak, their capacity for affection now seemed boundless. Daniel chose that moment to enter, his usually impeccable appearance softened by sleep. He wore a robe over his pajamas, his hair still damp from the shower. The sight of his children wrapped around Grace gave him pause, something complicated flashing in his eyes before he schooled his features into a smile. "Happy birthday," he said, his deep voice still rough with sleep. The twins turned, their faces lighting with quiet joy at seeing both their father and Grace together. It had become their new normal, this easy domesticity, though no one had yet put a name to what was growing between the adults. Breakfast was a lively affair by Hartwell standards. Liam carefully peeled the layers of his cinnamon roll, savoring each bite while Sophia dunked hers in milk until it fell apart, giggling silently at the mess. Grace caught Daniel watching them with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between wonder and sorrow and hope all tangled together. "Plans for the big day?" Daniel asked as he sipped his coffee. Grace smiled. "The zoo first, then the park for cake and presents. Assuming our birthday boy and girl are up for it." She turned to the twins, who nodded vigorously, their mouths full of sticky pastry. The zoo trip passed in a blur of animal encounters and silent childish wonder. Grace found herself constantly aware of Daniel's presence beside her, the way his hand occasionally brushed against hers as they walked, the low murmur of his voice explaining exhibits to the children. She noticed, too, how natural it felt, this pretend family outing, and how sharply the pang of knowing it wasn't real struck her when she least expected it. Back at the park, as Grace spread out the picnic blanket, Daniel excused himself with a cryptic, "I'll be right back." The twins barely noticed his absence, too engrossed in the chocolate cake Grace had made, a towering confection decorated with their favorite animals. It wasn't until the cake was eaten and presents opened that Daniel returned, his hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. The twins turned expectantly, but to everyone's surprise, he knelt before Grace instead of the children. The park sounds seemed to fade, the distant laughter of other children, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, even the twins' quiet breathing. Grace's hands stilled on the picnic basket as Daniel brought forth not another gift for the children, but a small velvet box. "Grace Johnson," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. "You saved my children when I couldn't. You brought light back into this house. You've given us all." He paused, swallowing hard. "You've given us all a second chance at happiness." The box opened to reveal a simple diamond ring, its brilliance catching the afternoon sun. Grace's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes darting to the twins, who were watching with knowing expressions that suggested they'd been in on this plan. "Marry me," Daniel said, the words not a question but a heartfelt plea. "Let's be a family." At Grace's stunned silence, Sophia suddenly stood and retrieved something from the picnic basket, a handmade sign she must have hidden earlier. She held it up with solemn pride, the letters painstakingly drawn in crayon. Please be our MO. Liam added his own silent plea, reaching for Grace's hand and pressing it to his cheek, his eyes suspiciously bright. The dam broke then. Tears spilled down Grace's face as she looked from the hopeful faces of the children to the raw vulnerability in Daniel's expression. This wasn't just a proposal, it was an adoption, a plea, a promise of belonging. Yes, she whispered, the word barely audible before she said it again, stronger. Yes. The twins launched themselves at her with enough force to nearly topple her over. Daniel caught them all in a clumsy embrace, his laughter mingling with Grace's quiet sobs. Nearby parkgoers glanced over and smiled at the scene, unaware they were witnessing the rebirth of a family. That evening, after baths and bedtime stories and a dozen whispered, "I love yous" from children who had once refused to speak, Grace stood on the mansion's grand balcony, the weight of the engagement ring still unfamiliar on her finger. Daniel joined her, handing her a glass of wine before settling close enough that their shoulders touched. "I know this is sudden," he began, staring out at the twilight. Grace shook her head. "Not really. Not for us." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear. Inside, the house that had once echoed with grief now held the soft sounds of sleeping children, the lingering scent of birthday cake, and the quiet promise of tomorrow. The Hartwell mansion glowed with warmth and laughter on the day of the wedding. Sunlight streamed through every window, casting golden pools across floors that had known too much silence in years past. The grand staircase, once a cold marble monument to opulence, now served as the perfect backdrop for Grace's entrance, its banisters entwined with gardenias and ivy that perfumed the air with their delicate scent. Grace stood at the top of those stairs, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the simple lace veil over her dark curls. The dress she had chosen was elegant in its understatement, a flowing ivory gown that skimmed her curves without constricting them, its only adornment the delicate embroidery along the sleeves that had been stitched by Sophia's careful hands over many secret afternoons. Around her neck lay the single strand of pearls that had been Emily's, Daniel's gift to her the night before as they sat together in the garden, speaking of the past and the future in equal measure. Downstairs, the small gathering of guests waited. There were no hundreds of society acquaintances, no ostentatious displays of wealth. Only those who truly mattered: the housekeeper who had stayed through the darkest days, the gardener who now grew flowers instead of merely maintaining hedges, the children's therapist who had become a friend, and of course, Liam and Sophia, resplendent in their miniature formal wear, their faces alight with a joy that went deeper than words. The music began, a soft piano piece that Grace had often hummed while cooking in those early days. As she descended the stairs, her gaze immediately found Daniel waiting at the bottom, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He looked heartbreakingly handsome in his charcoal gray suit, the one she had helped select because it brought out the silver at his temples. In his hands he held not flowers, but a small plate, the very first one Sophia and Liam had eaten from when Grace served them that life-changing meal of cornbread and fried chickens so many months ago. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of whispered vows and exchanged rings, of Liam solemnly presenting the rings on a velvet pillow and Sophia carefully tying a ribbon around their joined hands. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, it was the twins who cheered first, their voices ringing through the house with pure, unbridled happiness. The reception spilled out into the garden where long tables groaned under the weight of Grace's home cooking all the dishes that had marked their journey together. There was the macaroni and cheese that had coaxed the first real meal from silent children, the cinnamon rolls that had become birthday tradition, the apple pie Daniel loved served warm with vanilla ice cream that melted into the cracks of the flaky crust. As twilight fell and fireflies began to dance among the roses, Grace found herself standing at the edge of the garden, watching the scene before her. Daniel was deep in conversation with the children's therapist, his hand gesturing animatedly as he spoke. Liam and Sophia sat at a nearby table, their heads bent together over a shared slice of cake, occasionally stealing glances at their father and new mother with expressions of quiet contentment. A gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass as Grace took a deep breath, letting the reality of this moment settle into her bones. This was her family now. This sprawling house with its creaky floorboards and sun-dappled corners was her home. These children who had once refused to eat or speak now came to her with skinned knees and bad dreams, with artwork for the refrigerator and handmade gifts constructed from popsicle sticks and glitter. This man who had been frozen in grief now looked at her with eyes full of life and promise. Inside, the mansion that had once echoed with loneliness now resonated with music and laughter. The kitchen where Grace had prepared that first fateful meal stood ready for countless more breakfasts before school, midnight snacks for sleepless children, Sunday dinners with elbows on the table, and second helpings for everyone. The playroom no longer gathered dust but overflowed with toys and books and the occasional stray sock. The master bedroom, long kept as a shrine to Emily, now held traces of Grace, her hairbrush on the dresser, her favorite novel on the nightstand, her robe hanging beside Daniel's. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the twins were safely tucked into bed, though not before extracting promises of pancakes in the morning, Grace stood on the balcony outside their bedroom, the silk of her wedding gown whispering against her skin. Daniel joined her, slipping an arm around her waist as they looked out over the moonlit grounds. "It's a good house," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Grace smiled, leaning into his embrace. "It's a home," she corrected softly. And it was. In every creak of the floorboards, every smudge on the windows from small hands pressed against glass, every meal shared around the kitchen table, the Hartwell mansion had transformed from a monument to loss into a living, breathing testament to love's power to heal. The story ends as it began, with food, with family, with quiet moments that speak louder than words. The next morning would bring pancakes shaped like hearts, sticky maple syrup fingerprints on the counter, and two children climbing into bed with their parents to recount their dreams. There would be challenges ahead. Of course, parenting never came without them, but also countless ordinary miracles, the kind Grace had always believed in. As the moon cast its silvery light over the sleeping house, over the garden where wedding streamers still fluttered gently in the night breeze, one thing was certain: the Hartwell family, once broken, had been made whole again. Not by grand gestures or dramatic changes, but by the simple, sustaining power of love served one meal, one moment, one day at a time. The camera pulls back slowly, the mansion glowing like a beacon against the night sky, its windows shining with warmth and life. Somewhere inside, a child's laughter rings out, pure and clear and full of promise. Fade to black. The end.